Hello, Beastly Besties. Welcome back. This is the second podcast of the new weekly series that I'm going to be doing for you all. If you are new to the channel, I am Trish. I'm owner of Beastly Boutique. I am a cosplayer, alternative fashion enthusiast, and recently I have been into making my own wardrobe. So, just some little facts about me. Today, I want to talk to you guys about a topic that I get requested quite a lot to discuss, and that is about how to sell at an artist alley. If you are an independent artist or a craftsman, a lot of times a good way to get started and build your fan base is to sell at conventions, like anime conventions or Comic-Cons in their artist alley or dealer's hall. And I have been selling in the artist alley since 2013. If you guys watched my last podcast, you'll also know that 2013 is the year that I started my company. So I have been selling in Artist Alley since my very first year of business. And in the last 6 years, I have learned quite a lot about how to sell in Artist Alley. And I have some recommendations for you guys that I hope will help you get into the alley. And also, I can show you some improvements to my booth that has helped my sales grow exponentially. So this is going to be part one of this Artist Alley talk. I will probably have to separate this into multiple parts because it is probably going to be quite long. So let's get started. I'm going to talk to you guys about my first convention experience. So in the winter of 2012, I had just graduated college. I believe I graduated college that year. It was that spring I had graduated college. And I was looking for a way to start my business a little bit stronger than what I had done before. And that's kind of where I decided that I wanted to sell at conventions, because I had attended conventions, specifically anime conventions, since I was a child. I think my first convention is when I was like 9 or 10 years old, and it was Otakon back in Baltimore in the 90s. So I've been attending conventions for a while now, and I always saw the people selling their crafts, and I thought, you know what, this would be a great way to start marketing my products. Now, I am a 3D artist, so I do like costume horns and I do sewn crafts, things like that. So for me, the Artist Alley is a little bit different than for some of my colleagues who are print artists. So some of my advice may not be as applicable to a print artist. However, I think my general application process information and booth setup will still be pretty useful. So back in that winter of 2012, I applied for quite a few conventions. The first convention that I did was Setsuko in Penn State, and it was a smaller convention. And only 2 weeks after that, I did Katsucon, which is one of the biggest conventions on the East Coast, biggest anime conventions on the East Coast. And they were vastly different experiences, and I've had the honor of being able to go back to Katsucon multiple times after that. I've applied again for this year. We'll see how it goes, because that's the thing about working in an artist alley, is that you don't get in every year. So you have to learn how to deal with the rejection. And I will say my artist alley story started out pretty blessed, I guess, because I did get into every convention I applied to. I think I got into every convention I applied to for the first 2 or 3 years, and then I did get a couple of rejections after that. I was waitlisted a couple times. Sometimes I got in after that, and I was not accepted to Katsucon actually 2 years ago, but I did go back this year. So that's kind of part of the process, is you will have to apply to shows, and then you'll have to have a portfolio. So when you're starting out with Artist Alley, it is super important to be working on your online presence prior to applying for a show. Show organizers are usually looking for your art to make sure it's up to a certain quality or standard, and then they are looking to make sure that you are consistently producing new work, because that's something that I have heard that's been affecting a lot of my colleagues recently, is that they have become stagnant, or the showrunners have seen in their eyes that their artwork has become stagnant, so they haven't been accepted because their artwork didn't look like it was continually improving or continually making new products. And this wasn't necessarily true, I think, for some of these people, but that is something that show organizers are looking for, that your artwork is consistently changing, consistently improving, so that you're bringing something new each year to their audience. So when you're applying for an artist alley, it's important to already have your portfolio set up, and you don't have to have a lot of stuff. You just need to have a website with pictures that represent your artwork. It is helpful if you've done an artist alley before to also include pictures of your booth setup. And I will share the link below in the description that you guys can look at the page that I send to conventions that is kind of my portfolio. So it's part of my website, but I have a specific specific portfolio page that I send out to conventions that has pictures of my booth setup, pictures of my products, what products I'm going to be adding the next year, just kind of things that I know that they are looking for. In the actual application process, though, there is multiple ways that show organizers have you apply for their convention. So the first one that I am actually I'm not the biggest fan of, and that is the first come, first serve process. So the first come, first serve process involves you applying online in a set period of time, and they literally just take the first people to apply. So there's like a cutoff. So normally it's like, let's say 200 people. So the first 200 people get in. The issue I find with the first come, first serve process is you end up with an artist alley that does not necessarily have a lot of variety. Now this does work for larger shows, like I want to say Anime Boston does this, and they do it quite well. They also have something called a Pro Row, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. A Pro Row runs a little bit differently. Then the other way that most shows apply is a juried process. So the juried process is where they look at your portfolio, they look at your artwork, and then they select a range of artists that fit their artist alley. And I find that these artist alleys tend to be the most diverse. I've also found in my experience that I have had a better chance of getting into an artist alley when it is juried. And I think a lot of that is also because I do 3D, and there is not as much competition in the convention circuit for 3D craftsmen because there is a higher number of print artists. The other problem with being a 3D craftsman, though, is that it does limit the range of shows that I'm able to attend because, again, I have to bring my entire booth setup, which unfortunately I'm unable to do when I go, to multiple states. I really can't fly my booth setup out like a print artist would be able to do. So it does limit some of the conventions that I am able to apply to. The final way that I'm familiar with to apply to a artist alley is the combo juried / first come, first serve. And MagFest is one of the ones that does this. And I'm sorry, I'm talking mostly East Coast conventions, but those are the ones that I'm most familiar with living on the East Coast of the United States. So MagFest does this. What you do is basically you have a first come, first serve window where they take, I know in MagFest case it's 515. I just remember that number because it's a very strange number. But they take, let's say, 515 applicants, and then from there they jury the portfolios of those applicants and select the people they want to be in their artist alley from that jury pool. I find this one to be pretty interesting. I think it's fair because the problem with the just open window, it does work for smaller shows, just open window that they jury. It works for smaller shows or shows that have a just ginormous staff, but the problem with smaller shows or shows that have a smaller amount of staff, not saying that MagFest is a smaller show, I'm not sure how large of a staff they have for this kind of situation, is that it creates this huge window where they have to pull applications from. So with the juried first come, first serve, you still get the benefits of a juried show. However, they don't have as many applications to go through. And I think that that's a good way to do it. It's a little stressful when you're applying. I know I always feel pretty nervous. I have alarms set. I sit at my computer, continually refreshing, just trying to get in. And it's a little bit easier for me to apply as a full-time artist because I'm home and I can set up my schedule so that I'm there when the first come, first serve window opens. But I do know that it doesn't benefit as many people who are starting out in the artist alley, because it's a little bit harder if that window is during your working hours, since a lot of us do work retail when we start out, and retail hours tend to be at the same time that the application period's open for some reason. Just always happens that way. So that is the application process. Now, some shows you will just sign up and you're in, and it's not necessarily a first come first serve situation. That's, I believe, how Setsuko was, and you just kind of pay for your booth. That tends to be more of a Comic-Con way of doing it. In my experience, it was mostly Comic-Cons that you just pay for the booth and you're in. And they tended to not distinguish between the merchant side and the artist alley. So at a convention, there's actually two different halls normally. There's the dealer's hall and there is the artist alley. Now, sometimes they have a combined hall and you will have both in one, but artist alley tends to be handmade crafts and dealers tends to be purchased merchandise or licensed merchandise. So I've noticed at the Comic-Cons it tends to not be as separated. It tends to be in one hall, and usually you just pay for your booth. So that's kind of the experiences of how you apply for Setsuko. I believe that first year pretty sure I just signed up. I don't believe there was a jury process, but there very well could have been. And then the second show I did after that was Katsucon, which is a juried process. And I'd had my website hooked up, but I think actually when I applied for those first ones, I'm pretty sure I just gave them my Etsy link. And at this point, I was only making the cast resin horns that you guys are familiar with my brand. And I wasn't doing the chokers or the fashion accessories or ears or anything like that. I was just doing the costume horns at this point. So I'm pretty sure I just gave them my Etsy because I didn't have my website set up. Because I don't think I had my personal website really set up until about, I want to say it's been about 2 years that I've actually had that really set up and running where it was able to do e-commerce. So when I first applied, I used Etsy and I went to my first show. So my first show, Setsuko. Setsuko is literally Setsu. It's snow. It's in the winter in State College, Pennsylvania. And this is back when they were actually in State College. Now I believe that they're at the Blair County Convention Center in Altoona, Pennsylvania. But this is back when they were at the Penn Stater. And this was my very first convention in Pennsylvania. It was my first convention out of state because I was originally from Maryland. And I've moved since then. But it was super, super stressful. It had snowed that weekend and the roads were not great. Now, luckily, my significant other drove the entire weekend because I do not drive. And he was familiar with Pennsylvania roads, being from Pennsylvania. So he drove us to the convention in the snow, and we get there to the Penn Stater and we set up. Now, my first convention was unfortunately a bit of a horror story, and I'm glad that I didn't stop doing conventions after this. So the issue that I had with Setsuko, and I'm sure they have changed since then. I have actually not done the convention since this very first one because of the experience that I had there. But I think it's a fair experience that I think I want to really, you guys would enjoy. It was kind of a story. So at my first convention, they had the tables set up and we were in this, it was in a hotel. It was a hotel convention, which I will tell you guys are very, very different from like convention center conventions. Now, it can be like a hotel with a convention center, but this was just the Penn Stater. So it's a hotel with ballrooms. So we were set up in the ballroom and it had so many artists in this one tiny room. And the issue when we were setting up is that the aisles that they had set up for inside for us to put our stock and for us to sit in were only about 4 feet wide. And this is not standard practice. So the entire weekend we were kind of cramped into this small, tiny space where we had to keep both our product, and as a 3D artist, I have a lot of product. It's not like I just have a box of prints or a bag of prints. I have totes upon totes of product because it's for 3D, and there was nowhere else I could keep it because we couldn't like keep it in the hotel room and have to keep running up and down the stairs to get it. It just wasn't very practical. So we were cramped into a small space, and I had set up my display. Now, I'm going to try to put a picture in here if I can find one of my display, but if not, I will put the one from BronyCon, because my display was pretty similar, and I did that same year. And so what's going on in this photo? Oh my goodness. So this is pretty indicative of what I see for a lot of people starting out. And that is, you try to cram as much product into a small space as you possibly can. And the issue with that is it creates a very cluttered display, which makes it hard for your customer to see your product. It also tends to turn your customers off. I mean, they don't usually want to see a bunch of stuff crammed into one space. So I will say that this setup did affect my sales that weekend. There was other factors going on at that convention, though, and this is important if you're starting off as an artist in Artist Alley. It's important to know your audience and know what's going on. So this was a college convention in the winter, in January, and the issue was, it was the week after classes had started for Penn State students, and this convention was geared towards Penn State students. And the thing about college is your textbooks are extremely expensive. So the attendees themselves did not have a lot of funds at this convention. And it really affected the sales for the entire weekend of everyone there. So I didn't make a great profit. I actually want to say that I didn't make any profit at my first show. And I think that's pretty true for most artists. The reason you won't make a huge profit, or you won't make a profit at all, is that you're just not used to selling. And I'm not saying that you need to do that carnival barking where you're like trying to get people to look at your booth. No, it's really that your display usually is not as refined as the people around you who have been doing it for years. And you just need to kind of finesse your setup and your sales tactics. Make sure your products are looking nice. Work on your packaging. Because that's what I did, and I noticed that my sales increased exponentially, where I myself was not doing anything different. I'm a pretty passive seller at Artist Alley, and there is a lot of debate in the Artist Alley community about being a passive seller. Basically, I won't necessarily reach out to a customer. I don't talk to them first. I usually sit down and I might have my phone. Not that I'm necessarily playing with my phone, because I don't recommend that. I don't recommend that you're sitting there on your phone all day. But I'm also not really engaging necessarily right away with the customer. I kind of let them look around and look at my stuff, and then, you kind of get the vibe from people if they want to ask you a question or something like that, and then I'll be ready to answer it. So I'm trying to be attentive, but I'm not trying to be pushy. And I've noticed with the anime convention and the Comic-Con convention, there's a higher than average amount of attendees that have anxiety and, issues such as that. And a lot of times they get a little turned away if you're overly friendly towards them. So that's just kind of something that I learned, is kind of just a passive seller, and I've always kind of been that way, but what I really changed was the way that my booth looked like and how I had, set up my product. So that first year I didn't do great at my first convention. I did sell a decent amount, but my prices were also too low. I was underselling myself. And the reason is I was not confident in my work. So I had that kind of imposter syndrome where you think that your work isn't worth as much. And something that I have learned over the years is that there's a lot of perceived value. So if you're underselling yourself, it makes the perceived value of your product go down. So it's very important that you are pricing your products appropriately, because to undersell yourself makes your product seem less valuable, and that makes customers less likely to buy because they don't want to buy a cheap product. Now, you also don't want to overprice your product, so there's a very fine line between the two. You don't want to mark up your product for the sake of marking it up. You want it to have a reasonable value, is what I like to say. So over the years, I have steadily increased the price of my costume horns as the price of materials has gone up and as my following has increased, because the value of my work has gone up. When I first started out, I was selling some of my costume horns for only $5, and I noticed that a lot of people were not purchasing my costume horns at $5, and I also wasn't paying myself enough to make them. So I have steadily increased the cost as the level of my craftsmanship has gone up to basically pay myself more per hour to justify the amount of time and labor that goes into my product. And this is kind of that delicate balance that you need to find. And it's really important when you're setting up for an artist alley that you're pricing your products appropriately and that you're not underselling yourself. I know that we've all been to that convention where you see a bunch of stuff thrown on a table. That is also something that you need to be wary of. It's really important for you to practice your setup ahead of time. What I always do prior to a show is I will take my display and I will put it in my living room because that's like the biggest place in my house to set stuff up. So I'll set up my display and I'll practice where I'm going to be putting my product. And what I've learned over the years, I'm going to put a picture of one of my newer conventions here for you guys to see. What I've learned over the years is that less is more. Having less of your product out is actually better than overfilling and overstocking your product. It does two things. It creates a demand. So when people see less product on the shelf, they're more likely to buy it because they feel that it's going to run out. Which, in some cases, this is true for my products because it does tend to run out of a lot of colors and my ears do sell pretty fast at conventions. So certain items I will overstock, like my costume ears, just because they go extremely fast. And there's a perception that happens when people see that you had a huge amount of product and now you don't. It kind of creates this demand that things are selling fast. But for my items that I have a little bit more in stock of, I'm going to put a little less out because that creates the demand. So overstocking your products does not help you unless it is something that is going to sell extremely fast because it doesn't create the demand for your customer. So that's a mistake that I see happen all the time. I see it at craft shows, I see it at anime conventions, I see it at Comic-Cons, places that I go, is that artists just pile their table with all of their crafts and it's just hard to see what you're trying to purchase because it's just a cluttered mess. People like organization, but it also doesn't create the demand that things are selling out. The other problem though that I have seen is people putting too little on their table. If your table is not engaging to the eye, people are not going to stop by. So a thing that is really important to learn to do is to start moving your products up and off the actual table surface. A lot of times things sitting on the table surface do not sell. So if you can move your product up to the eye level of the customer as they're walking by in a crowd, you're more likely to sell your product. So if you notice, I tend to take my costume horns and I put them in a visually appealing pattern. I do a rainbow pattern and I hang them in order by kind of what they are and price range. This creates a nice visual that catches the eye. They're bright colors, they're neatly organized, and this makes customers more likely to gravitate towards your product than if I had them just sitting stacked on the table. It puts it at eye level and makes it intriguing. That is kind of the main point that you want to make sure is that you have the proper display prior to going to the convention. So, let's be real. Conventions are gonna cost money when you first start out, but that's the cost of doing business. A couple things that you absolutely are going to need when you start an artist alley to be properly branded and to have your best foot forward is you should absolutely get yourself a banner. Banners are extremely affordable if you go to places like Vistaprint or Gotprint online. I believe I get my banners most of the time from Vistaprint and they're around $20. A banner is going to brand your product so people can buy your purchase, but it also helps customers find your booth because conventions are kind of crazy and a lot of times people tend to walk around first. I know I do this when I'm attending. They walk around, you look at the product, and then you kind of decide where you want to come back and purchase things from later. So having a banner gives them something to look for so they can come find you later to make that purchase. Remember, conventions are crazy and they're kind of busy and you might forget things, but you usually are going to remember that banner for the product that you wanted to buy, and it helps create a visual for your booth. It also then helps to direct customers to finding your booth later on if they want to follow you on social media or things like that. So it's really important to also have your business cards. Business cards go pretty fast at a convention, so you want to make sure you have a decent amount of them. What happens is people pick them up, and in my experience, I have seen an increase of sales after the show because people have taken my business card, they've gone home, waited till they had a little bit more money because conventions are quite expensive, and in the 2 to 3 weeks after the show, I see a bump in sales on my online store because people have taken my business card and gone back and looked at my products later on. I also see an increase in my social media traffic for the same reason. So it's important to have a business card that they can take, or a tangible item they can take with you that kind of has your information so they can find you later. You can also do, I've seen this, and this is more common nowadays because everyone has a smartphone, that you have just an image that has your contact information with a little sign that says "Take a picture of me, digital business card." I don't know how effective this is going to be because, I don't know how many people are looking back and for that information, but I do know people do take a lot of pictures during a convention. So this might be an effective practice if you are a little bit lower on funds and you don't have time to get business cards, or you don't have the money to get business cards right away. Just doing something like this is a nice, simple way to get started, but have your branding and your information available for customers to take with them. The other thing you're going to want to have is a tablecloth. Now, do not assume that the convention is going to provide you a tablecloth. I can count on my hand probably how many conventions in the last 6 years have provided a tablecloth. They normally do not. So have a tablecloth, and make sure it's not one of those cheap plastic ones that are meant for like picnics or something like that. Get a nice cloth tablecloth. If you cannot afford a cloth tablecloth, like a actual finished tablecloth, you can also get fabric and you can hem the seam or hem the end of it to make it look nice. And it also is good if you're choosing a tablecloth to try to keep it on brand. Some colors that I would avoid, because I see this pretty commonly at conventions, I would really stay away from like baby pink and royal purple. Now, I'm being a little bit hypocritical because yes, my booth, I do use a purple tablecloth because my brand colors are gray, black, and purple. But I do see more and more tables with the royal purple or dark purple tablecloth and the like baby pink tablecloth, and it makes it hard to distinguish tables between each other. I know a lot of us tend to do those pastel kawaii pink and purple blue colors like the lilac, the baby blue, the baby pink. You're going to have a lot of competition in that color range, so just be mindful of your colors. Try to make them as unique as possible so that people are a little bit easier to find your booth, but you also want them to be visually appealing. You definitely want to try to stay away from red. Red creates a sense of urgency, and it tends to make people not want to stay as long at your booth. So do look into color theory. I know we're getting pretty deep on this, but when you're picking your brand colors, try to kind of research the color theory of it a little bit, because having soothing colors or having colors that invoke a sense of wealth or a sense of luxury, just think about what you're trying to promote with your brand when you're picking your colors and your tablecloth, because that is going to influence how people perceive your brand at the booth. Remember, they're getting a lot of visual information and you want to stand out. The other thing that you're going to want to do is have some way to get your items up and off the table. A couple of things that I see used pretty often, or that I used in the beginning, are mini grids. They can be purchased at like Target and Walmart. You can purchase them online, and normally I recommend purchasing these from store supplies online. They are 14-inch wire grids. I'll post a picture of them up here for you guys on the screen. They are 14-inch wire grids, and what they do is they let you hang peg hooks. You can make them into box shapes to put small items, but basically they get the items up and off the table. If you're a print artist, you're going to want to get backdrop of some sort so that you can hang your prints. I don't have a ton of experience with that, but I have seen it a lot. Try to stay away from PVC pipes for actually hanging your prints. They tend not to hold up as well. I've seen them fall down so many times at conventions, and it's just not very safe. So if you can avoid the PVC pipe setup unless you have a really good way to secure it, I highly recommend it, because it also doesn't look very professional to have PVC pipes that are unpainted and just on your display. And again, I'm being a bit of a hypocrite right here because I do put up my banner with unpainted PVC pipes. Hopefully by my next show, which is going to be NecoCon in November, I have my pipes painted, but I can't guarantee that because I always perpetually forget until the last minute. But yeah, so you try to stay away from PVC pipes. Try to go with a proper backdrop holder. I don't know what they're called. But they're available on Amazon usually for a pretty reasonable price, as well as eBay. So try to go as professional as you can with this. And then the other thing that I see a lot is like just small objects like spice racks or cake stands. Be creative. Find things to get your product up and off the table. Because again, if it's flat on the table, people are not looking at it. It just is the facts of life. If you're going to offer commissions, make sure that you have some sort of printed out material that has pictures of your commissions. I don't recommend having a sketchbook because people do not flip through them, unfortunately. Having a sketchbook or a binder just usually doesn't help, but if you have some visual representation that is up and off the table, be it on a poster board that's being held up, or be it on a backdrop, just something to get your products up and off the table, it's definitely going to help going forward so that you are noticeable as people walk by. So that's kind of like the main points of finessing your setup. I'm going to start talking on the next part. I'm going to break this here because we're already at 30 minutes. I'm so sorry, guys. I kind of went on, but this is all really important information. The next part, I'm going to talk about selling at larger conventions. So my first show was Setsuko, obviously small convention. I don't even think there was maybe 1,000 attendees. It was quite tiny. The next one I did right after that, though, was KatsuCon, which is a huge convention. I think it's 10,000 plus back when I went. So it's a very different atmosphere. So in the next convention I'm going to talk about in part 2 is KatsuCon. I'm talking about larger conventions and how to set up and sell at larger conventions. I'll also probably talk about the move from Artist Alley to Dealers Hall, because I find myself moving more and more towards Dealers Hall because I need the space. So if you made it to this part, thank you so much for joining me on the second podcast. I want to just show my appreciation from everyone who reached out and told me how much they enjoyed the first podcast. And I just want to thank everyone for joining. I hope that you like this. If you can give me a like and subscribe if you want to see more of these in the future, I would absolutely love that. You can also leave me any feedback below in the comments. If you have any questions as well about Artist Alley that you want me to cover, please leave that below, because I like to talk about my experience, and I like to share that with others. So I'm going to end this here, but thank you guys for joining, and in part 2 we will discuss more about selling at Artist Alley.